Hello again, 102. To conclude Chapter 30 on the late 20th century and 21st century America, we will identify some of President Obama's achievements and goals in domestic and foreign policy. And during his first term, there were the Wall Street bank bailouts, and bank bailouts were highly controversial. They were attacked by both the left and right as deeply unfair to most struggling Americans. Had they not saved the big banks, President Obama and Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, this is what they argued. They said if we don't do this, the whole economy would have crashed. And then after they bailed out the banks, they came up with the economic stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And preserving the banking system did not create new jobs because the banks took that money, reinvested it in the stock market, made the money back to repay those loans that were given to them by the federal government, and did not loan them out to individual Americans. So to do so in mid-February of 2009, after a prolonged debate, Congress passed and Obama signed an $832 billion economic stimulus bill called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The bill included cash distributions to states for construction projects to renew the nation's infrastructure, roads and all of those other things, which is still going on and it still needs to be done. Money for renewable energy systems, that's quite controversial, for solar power and all of those sorts of things. $212 billion in tax reductions for individuals and businesses, as well as additional funds for food stamps and unemployment benefits. It was the largest government infusion of cash into the economy in history. In the end, however, it was not large enough to generate a robust economic recovery, as we mentioned previously. Healthcare reform is President Obama's greatest legacy. From his first day in office, Obama stressed his intention to reform a healthcare system and the president's goal in creating patient protection and the Affordable Care Act, which many people referred to as Obamacare, was to make health insurance more affordable and make health care accessible for everyone, regardless of income. The $940 billion health care law, proposed in 2009 and debated over bitterly for a year, centered on the so-called individual mandate, which required uninsured adults to purchase an approved private insurance policy made available through state-run exchanges, websites where people could shop for insurance. Lower-income Americans were provided with federal subsidies to help pay for their coverage. Insurance companies could no longer deny coverage to people with pre-existing illnesses. And employers who did not offer health insurance also would have to pay higher taxes, and drug companies as well as manufacturers of medical devices would have to pay annual government fees. Everyone, but especially the wealthy, would pay higher Medicare payroll taxes to help fund the changes. Despite heated Republican opposition, the Affordable Care Act passed with narrow party line majorities in both houses of Congress. President Obama signed the new legislation on March 23, 2010. And again, the Affordable Care Act, the big thing that Mr. Obama wanted to do was to make health care accessible to everyone, regardless of income or prior medical conditions. And Republicans bitterly oppose this, and this argument continues to this day. And as of right now, the present Congress is not going to repeal this act. And the courts also upheld the Affordable Care Act on June the 28th because once this passed, Republicans immediately started filing lawsuits against it. And on June 28, 2012, the Supreme Court issued a much-awaited decision in the case of National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius. The landmark 5-4 ruling surprised court observers by approving most of the new federal law. John G. Roberts, the philosophical conservative Chief Justice, who had never before voted with the 4 liberal justices on the court, upheld the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate that required people to buy private health insurance or else pay a tax. He argued that it was within the Congress's power to impose taxes, as outlined in Article 1 of the Constitution. Many conservatives, including the 4 dissenting justices, felt betrayed by Roberts' unexpected decision. The surprising verdict led the New York Times to predict that the ruling may secure Obama's place in history. This is pretty much his biggest achievement. The Obama Doctrine in Iraq. President Obama had more success in dealing with foreign affairs than in reviving the American economy. His foremost concern was the overextension of U.S. power abroad. What journalists came to call the Obama Doctrine was very much like the Nixon Doctrine in stressing that the United States could not afford to continue to police the world, and we'll see why momentarily. The Obama Doctrine reflected the president's efforts to end 2 complex and expensive wars, one in Iraq and the other in Afghanistan. And on February 27, 2009, Obama announced that he would withdraw all 142,000 U.S. troops from Iraq by the end of 2011. And true to his word, the last U.S. combat troops left Iraq in December 2011. Their exit marked the end of a bitterly decisive war that had raged for nearly 9 years. And there wasn't a lot to celebrate when those troops came home, and we'll see what the legacy is here. The U.S. intervention in Iraq had cost over 4,500 American lives, 30,000 wounded, many grievously so, more than 110,000 Iraqi lives, and $2 trillion. Perhaps the greatest embarrassment was that the government the United States left behind in Iraq was inept and not even friendly to American interests. And later, at the end of the Obama administration in 2016 and continuing now, the Islamic State in Iraq, or ISIS, will be successful in taking over parts of Iraq, and they're still clashing with the Iraqi government today and with the Kurdish minority groups in the north. $2 trillion. There was the surge in Afghanistan. At the same time that President Obama was reducing the United States military involvement in Iraq, he dispatched 21,000 additional troops to Afghanistan. While doing so, however, he narrowed the focus of the U.S. mission to suppressing terrorists, rather than what George Walker Bush had called nation building, the dubious idea of transforming strife-torn Afghanistan into a stable capitalist democracy. The military surge worked as hoped, and by the summer of 2011, President Obama announced that the United States had largely achieved its goals in Afghanistan, setting in motion a substantial withdrawal of forces between 2011 and 2014. In April 2014, Afghans turned out in huge numbers to choose a new president to lead them into the post-American era. But it was an expensive outcome for America's longest war. In the 13 years since the United States had invaded Afghanistan in 2001, America had spent over $1 trillion there and lost 2,300 military personnel. If you wonder why there hasn't been a robust economic recovery, this is why. They've spent $3 trillion in fighting these 2 wars. Unbelievable amounts of money. And then came the death of Osama bin Laden. The crowning achievement of Obama's anti-terrorist efforts was the discovery at long last of Osama bin Laden's hideout. Ever since the attacks of 9/11, bin Laden had eluded an intensive manhunt after crossing the Afghan border into Pakistan. His luck ran out in 2011, however, when the United States intelligence analysts discovered his sanctuary in a walled residential compound outside of Abbottabad, Pakistan. And on May 2, 2011, President Obama authorized a daring night raid by United States Navy SEAL Team 6. And this was 24 commandos. And after a brief firefight, the SEAL team killed bin Laden and then dropped his body into the sea. Bin Laden's death was a watershed moment, but it did not spell the end of Islamist terrorism, as I just mentioned, with the ISIS controversy. Obama broke new ground in reestablishing formal diplomatic relations with Cuba in 2016. In March, the U.S. president flew to Havana for meetings with the Castro regime. And he was the first U.S. president to visit Cuba since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. And as he told the Cuban people, "My lifetime has spanned a time of isolation between us. I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas." And that concludes Chapter 30 and American Nation 2.